咁我哋而家夠鐘可以開會。
It's time. I call to order the meeting. First of all, I will invite the administration to join us here. Thank you. At the meeting on the 17th of July, members raised various issues for follow-up, and then Dr. Helena Wong sent a letter on the 11th of September. The administration has provided a written response. That's paper number CB bracket 22104 stroke 16 to 17 bracket 3. As for list of follow-up actions arising from the discussion and meeting on the 28th of September, and another letter issued by Dr. Helena Wong on the 27th of September, the administration has also provided a response as a paper number CB bracket 216 stroke 17 to 18 bracket 02. And then I invite the administration to join us, and they will first of all respond to members' questions. And also, if members have other questions on the bill, you're welcome to put them to the administration. Let's see, we could start with clause-by-clause scrutiny today. Hopefully, after all the questions have been asked and answers given, then maybe we could start a clause-by-clause scrutiny today. Mr. Chen, are you going to take us through the paper, please? Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Some time ago already issued a written response. Perhaps we could go straight to questions so to allow members more time for questions. Okay, thank you. Any questions, please? You can go start, go through each paper to put questions. Dr. Helena Wong, 16. I think I'm talking about the questions raised for the 17th of July. There are 4 types of licenses for regulating the medicine traders. How come for importers of Chinese medicines they don't need to be licensed? Dr. Choi? Well, there are actually 4 types of licenses. Yes. Dr. Choi, can you please turn on Dr. Choi's microphone, please. Yes, we have 4 types of Chinese medicine trader licenses for retailers, wholesalers of Chinese herbal medicines, and manufacturers and wholesalers of proprietary Chinese medicines. And wholesaler of CHMs and PCMs are also importers. So the importing requirements are already covered in the wholesaler licenses. So wholesalers are equivalent to importers. Is that it? Dr. Choi? Wholesalers may import herbs or medicines, or they could just engage in wholesaling. So yes, there are no licensed importers then. So the government's approach is to equate wholesalers as importers. Do you restrict the sources of supply, and or do you know the origins of the goods? And in terms of heavy metal and pesticide content, is that subject to certain requirements, or do you not keep, do you not impose any restrictions at all, and you're not able to trace the source of the supply? Is that the case? Dr. Choi. Now, in the license conditions, wholesalers of CHMs must buy decoction pieces from reliable and reputable sources. Most of the decoction pieces are imported from overseas. For Chinese medicines, there are 2 parts, of course. One is the herbal medicines or the raw materials. Now, Chinese medicine has to be processed in some way, sometimes cooked in wine or steamed. So it's common on the mainland to do this to remove the toxicity or to enhance the efficacy of the medicine. And after such treatment, we call that decoction pieces. So in other words, if you go to a medicine shop, you can just buy that and for cooking yourself. For Chinese medicine wholesaler, if they buy decoction pieces, they must buy from reputable suppliers. And as I said, the majority of the decoction pieces is imported from the mainland. Now, according to the PRC requirements, if anyone is to engage in the manufacturing of Chinese medicine, that person must first receive a permit for manufacture. And to receive that permit, that means that company must meet the GMP requirements. So the company must meet the GMP requirements and receive the permit before they could manufacture Chinese herbal medicines, including decoction pieces. And then also in Hong Kong, of course, when we do our routine inspection, we will check where the wholesalers buy from. And from our guideline, the wholesalers must keep all invoices for 2 years, so we can then find out whether they buy from sources with licenses or permits. Now there are so many wholesalers and retailers. We've asked them all, do they all source from manufacturers meeting the GMP requirements? Yes, you pointed out that on the mainland they have their own requirements. But what about Hong Kong? Does the Department of Health have any legislative requirements? So they can only buy from sources with GMP certification, and only then would you give them the license to import and wholesale in Hong Kong. So do we have any legislative requirements that they must source from GMP certified manufacturers on the mainland? Dr. Choi. Now, the law states that if someone is to run a Chinese medicine business, the person must make sure the medicine is safe and has the stated efficacy. And we have a handbook on licensing, or a code on licensing for wholesaler. Or first of all, there must be proper premises that are clean. And then there must be proper places for storage of Chinese medicine, and medicines must be properly labeled so they can't be confused. And then for retailers and wholesalers of Chinese medicine, there must be someone in charge. In other words, the person is responsible for checking, receiving, supply, and make sure everything is in compliance. And then we will conduct routine inspections. And we will note the hygiene condition of the premises, how medicines are stored. We'll also inspect invoices of the purchase. And if we find there are invoices that look dubious without proper sources, we will take follow-up action. We also keep in close liaison with the law enforcement agencies on the mainland. If we have any doubt about the source of supply, then we will check with the relevant authorities to verify the source. Now, in our inspection so far, we have found that in terms of the purchase, sales, and storage of medicine, so far the practice has been good. And where there is under par practice, we will take disciplinary actions under the Chinese Medicines Board. Dr. Choi has not answered my question, Madam Chair. My question is for Chinese medicines on the mainland. There are now new laws and codes to state that GMP requirements must be met. I'm asking whether in Hong Kong we have the same legal requirements. And just now you told us you will check the storage condition, you will check the invoices, but you have not answered me. In law, do we require wholesalers who import also and retailers that they would only source from GMP certified manufacturers? I checked with the I checked with the hospital authority. Hospital authority also has outpatient Chinese medicine clinic, and they make sure they will only source from GMP certified manufacturers. But let's say if I have flu and I just walk into any Chinese medicine shop to get a concoction, and they may give me some Chinese herbal medicines, but maybe I don't know where the source is, whether it's a GMP source or not. So is there any legal requirement now? Dr. Choi, can you just answer yes or no? In law, it does not state where the medicines could be sold. Not sold by. Now, yes, to buy. And I mentioned that in the code, it's stated clearly that they must source from reputable suppliers. And if our wholesalers buy from the mainland, they can approach directly places with GMP certificates, or they could buy from businesses with the permits from the mainland authorities for selling GMP products. So we don't have a legal requirement that the wholesaler must buy from only GMP certified places. They could also buy from other places with the relevant permits. But that's just a code. Is it legally binding? How come on the mainland they legislate to regulate that, but in Hong Kong we don't do the same? Are we opening up a floodgate or opening up a door? So for importers of PCMs or CHMs, they want to make more profit. They may go to sources without stringent quality control. They approach the small scale farmers directly, and maybe the heavy metal or pesticide contents exceed the limits, or maybe they don't follow good manufacturing practice. And then when they bring in such medicines, you can't really safeguard the health of the citizens. If we want to take Chinese medicine, probably because we want to cure disease or to tone up the body, but we certainly don't want to take contaminated herbal medicines. So how come you don't take this opportunity to regulate that as well? Dr. Choi, after you finish answering the question, please stop for a while. I need to deal with some house procedures.
Our licensing regime allows us in the guidelines to investigate whether the licensed operator complies. If they breach the guideline requirements, then according to the Chinese Medicine Council, they can suspend the operator's license. So in our inspection, we understand legislators' concern whether there is public health risk. If so, we will take immediate follow-up action. Currently, in our investigations, we see that the compliance to the guidelines is quite good. And of course, we have special cases where we need to take sanctions and penalty actions. So the market monitoring mechanism, we want to see that the medicine being sold is safe. We also have another system for alarm items, or when the hospital authority comes across cases, we can take immediate action. So we do rely on these systems to keep an eye on the market, to keep an eye on the proprietary medicines, and take the follow-up actions. Please stop for a while. I'd like to ask the two other legislators, Dr. Chan and Mr. Siu Gafai, do you have any questions? Let's allow Mr. Siu to ask some questions. I'm aware that this amendment bill, since our last deputation meeting till this meeting, I've heard the members and deputations, they have different views on other parts of the amendment bill, including the development of Chinese medicine, the definitions, and Ms. Helena Wong is concerned about quality control, the country of origin, and so on. But I've considered, on this amendment occasion, could the government deal with the other issues? But if we look at the Clause 1, the long title is about empowering the officials to deal with product recall. So this amendment, the legal advisor can correct me if I'm wrong, the scope of this bill is, even if we want to amend other parts of the bill, it has to be done on other occasions. They cannot do it on this occasion because your long title deals with product recall. So you'll have to deal with it in a separate occasion. So on one hand, we do have sufficient time. I would like more discussion in detail, but I feel that the government needs to bear in mind that a lot of people are using this opportunity to deal with other topics. So the government needs to identify an occasion. First of all, I think we will need to deal with it in the panels, or should it be the health panel or food hygiene? So health panel. So the secretary, you can relate this information back to your colleagues. So if the government is willing to deal with it in the panel, we can handle these topics. I think we also have an opportunity, and I urge the government to meet with the industry. And as Mr. Siu Gafai and Ms. Helena Wong, they are concerned with the development, and Ms. Helena Wong is concerned about regulation of the industry. So you need to meet and have further discussion, and when necessary, you can propose an appropriate amendment and review. I'd like to give you sufficient discussion time, but I need to remind you, we cannot handle your amendments. We are only dealing with a product recall on this occasion. Thank you. Let me supplement. Whether this is relevant to the Blue Bill, Rules of Procedure, Clause 57, paragraphs A deal with that. So the clause says that the amendment has to be related to the theme, the title. So that has to be ruled by the chairman. So the chairman will look at all the relevant documents, as the chairman mentioned, the long title, the summary brief, and other relevant information. So in the previous government response to my questions, they seem to feel that this amendment bill has a narrow scope. It is purely about empowering the Department of Health, Deputy Director of Health, to issue the safety order or a suspension of the sales of certain items. So the chairman will have to decide, the president will have to consider, and will make a decision after consultation. So if we digress too much, I think the government will also object. Okay, it's just for your information. So I hope the government should be aware that there's a lot of dissatisfaction with other parts of the ordinance, and you should be made aware through the meeting with deputations and so on. I agree, Chairman. Regarding the Chinese medicine ordinance or the whole development of TCM, we need to meet and discuss in detail in other venues. So when we propose any amendment, we need to consult the industry. For example, in proprietary medicine or Chinese medicine standards, whenever we undertake an amendment, we need to meet with the industry. On this occasion, the bill and product recall, we have already had full discussion with the industry and we have their support. So dealing with other items that have not been consulted with the industry, we feel that is not an opportune moment or a mature moment. So we can have further discussion in other panels or venues before we propose a amendment proposal. So, Mr. Siu Ka-fai, I thought we had sufficient time, but I might have been overly optimistic. But we might have to control your time. So let's give you 10 minutes to start. Mr. Siu Ka-fai. Chairman, you were correct. The review of the Chinese medicine ordinance in Hong Kong society, we do have a lot of issues. I'll give you an example. The government and its departments, they had met with homeopathy. They had a meeting. And what are they talking about? At the beginning of the year, some people were using acupuncture or even massage, and they could come under the regulatory scope of the Chinese medicine ordinance. For example, when you get a massage, and the operator says that they can help improve blood flow. So when you use these kinds of phrases, you might come under the regulatory regime. So since I have time, let me elaborate further. So the Chinese medicine ordinance says that to practice medicine under Chinese medicine concepts. So what do we mean by practicing medicine under Chinese medicine? Well, if you're talking about regulating bodily functions, well, that already covers that. So in Hong Kong, we have different service providers. They say they'll help you improve your lumbar flow and your blood flow. Well, but according to the ordinance, only a registered TCM practitioner can do that. But a lot of beauty parlors, they are not TCM practitioners, but in the past, they have been doing that all the time. They have been doing cupping. So what does cupping do? It improves the blood flow. It might help a person, hydrate a person. So in recent years, we have a lot of these industry operators who might fall afoul. So we have ERB, Employer Retraining Board, instructors. They are already teaching this stuff, but after so many years, they're not even sure whether they are breaking the law. It's because they might come under the regulatory scope of this ordinance. Is it Cap 549? In 1999, it dates back to 1999. We didn't have a lot of these therapies. So do we need to review that? As Chairman said, you are correct. Now, even though we're talking about product recall in this bill, it's not directly related, but this ordinance covers a lot of things. Today, we're just talking about product recall, but you don't deal with that. So I'll have to pick it up in another panel. So that might take another 2 years. But why did we have such a large meeting? A lot of people are already doing this business. The people doing the teaching, they don't dare teach it. We have a lot of spas and massage people in this providing this sort of service. So at this, shouldn't we consider this at this point in time? Otherwise, we'll be dragging our feet another 2-3 years. So these shops, they don't know whether they should continue operating, and we don't know whether instructors should continue teaching. Just yesterday, Mr. Fong, the meeting was scheduled for 1 hour, but it ran to 1 hour 45 minutes. And So even after discussion, they still weren't sure whether they were breaking the law or not. So we will continue this discussion, and Chairman, I agree with what you said just now. We should deal with it all in one go. So coming back to our bill, last time when we talked about product recall, you heard the industry. They talk about 7+1. So in the TCM components, you can add some Western medicines such as vitamin C. So that's not the Chinese medicine. So they call it 7+1. It's a supplement. So we asked the question, if that is, will that be included in the product recall system? If not, then can they continue to deal with it in their previous practice? Who can answer that? Dr. Choi? Just now, the legislator talked about some products having TCM, Chinese medicine, and they add low dosage of vitamin C. So under the Chinese medicine ordinance, these items are not covered by they are not proprietary medicines, so these are not covered. So on the last occasion, I also mentioned that even for the definition of proprietary medicine, we do have a working group. We want to review the definition, whether there's a need to review that, and how should we review that. So after convening the first meeting in October, we'll have the second meeting. So when we get expert consensus, our next step will be to take the definition, and we'll take it back to the Chinese Medicine Board under the Chinese Medicine Council. We will consult the public first. Mr. Xu, I understand, I know you're very hardworking, you meet with the industry, but I would like to tell you what's happening in Hong Kong. In the past, the Chinese medicine was regulated very tightly, such as having GMP requirements and so on. They want to safeguard Hong Kong public health. But if that Chinese medicine, if they add vitamin C, it's harmless. It might be better, but I can't say that. So in Hong Kong, we have this group of items we don't even know how to label it. You might call it 7+1 or a supplement. So in the market, the 7+1 supplements outnumber traditional Chinese medicine, because if they apply for traditional Chinese medicine, they might have to wait 2-3 years, and they'll have to use different methods. They need GMP and proof and so on. But if they add some vitamin C, it is not regulated. So they might be able to have the product on the shelves in 3 days' time. If you look at the packaging, it might be similar. Even the name might be the same. It's just that the different factory name. So the general public, they look at the better packaging, and if you look at the franchise stores, they might have more confidence, and people will purchase these kinds of products. I'll repeat.
Now, I must stress, it doesn't mean that those products are not good. Probably they could be even better. But then the people of Hong Kong won't understand. We're talking about traditional Chinese medicines with a therapeutic effect. Now, for these products, they put it in such a way as if they're a therapeutic effect, but it's actually not the same thing, because the law is already distorted. So it's really strange in the market in Hong Kong. This kind of products account for far more than the real medicinal products. I asked people before, how come when they first enacted this law, they didn't include this? But because at the time, the 7+1 products were small in number, and this current law would have covered 90, 80, 70 or 80% or even 90% of all the products. At the time, the 7+1 products were few in number. But, you know, after the law was enacted, of course, you know, businessmen are always so smart. Immediately, they could do better business by, say, adding vitamin C or whatever, and because they don't need to be regulated, of course, they shift all their products to the other category. For the 100-year-old brand medicines, they just do something very similar to what they have. So now the market has reversed. It's now 80% of the market are these 7+1 products without regulation. Well, that's why Dr. Helena Wong always worried that about this. So you can see things have been reversed. Now you're doing the review now. Well, it's better late than never, but it's really overdue. But how long are you going to take? If you let you pass this bill, maybe it will take another 2-3 years. It's the same about massage and so on. This is all medicine, medical treatment, but you just allow it in the market. And then when products are recalled, these are not covered. Why do we want to amend this law on recall? Because we want to give better protection to the public. We want to follow the practice for medicine, Western medicine. But how come? The 7+1 products take up a bigger market than the traditional products, and they are not regulated at all. So why don't you act quickly, deal with it? It's good that you talk to the industry, but God knows how long it would take for you to talk to them. Maybe now this law only regulates 10 or 20% of the products. These could be subject to recall by law, but for the other products, they could not be recorded at all because you don't have the authority to do anything. Then what do we do? Mr. Chen, the administration agrees with Mr. Chiu that we need to see how we regulate those products. As I said, we've already set up an expert group. And we hope the expert group will come up with recommendations soon, and then the Chinese Medicines Board will consider them. And if they agree, then we will immediately start extensive industry consultation. So we will press ahead with that task. Dr. Helena Wong. Thank you for the information. We know, of course, we must not digress in our discussion. I do know that this bill is about giving powers to the government to recall problematic PCMs. We agree this should be done. But why I'm asking so many questions and putting in so many papers? It took me a lot of time too. If I'm lazy, I'll just let this bill pass. The reason why I have to ask for so many details is because the way the bill is drafted now, in terms of the reasons for banning, for prohibiting sale, or for directing recall, is that medicine harms or is dangerous to health. So health concern is the reason why we want to amend this law. And I agree, we need to do it. Because when the public go and buy PCMs or CHMs for enhancing health or for treating a problem, they don't want to take in problematic medicines. But then this line is so vague. It says that it endangers or is harmful to health, and for this reason you prohibit sale. Now, Mr. Shilkap, well, he's left the room. He's in touch with those selling the medicine. But actually for consumers or buyers, their concern is what is considered dangerous or injurious to health. So that calls into the question of standards, the source of supply, and storage. So these are all related. And that's why I asked so much about GMP. Because when we talk about GMP, there will be a regulation of the source of supply. The source could be traced, and there will be batch numbers. So through the mainland systems, we could track or trace the source of supply. And then I also asked a lot about heavy metal, pesticide residues, or sulfur dioxide, because there's no standard for sulfur dioxide, but on the mainland there is. So that's why I'm asking so many questions, because we don't get the standards right. We don't get right where we get the supply and then the source is reliable, then we don't give you the license. So if we don't get it right, then there will be ambiguity open to debate. And people will argue with you what is meant by injurious to health. As a regulator and a supervising authority, it's fine that we give the powers to the government to do it, but what is important is how you do the regulation. You know, the source of supply, the standards of the medicines, the assay and testing methods. You need to tell us how this is done. Otherwise, how can we give you the powers? We can't just take you on trust. Yes, Dr. Choi, I know you're a nice person, but you have to explain to members in this council and the community that we know how you're going to execute this power when we give it to you. And now we see a loophole in the law, because when you issue license, you don't say that they must buy from GMP manufacturers. You say reputable suppliers are good enough. But what exactly are reputable suppliers? You can't tell us. In that case, on what basis do you seize people's PCMs or CHMs? And in terms of the testing standards, you haven't set any standards. For sulfur dioxide, there's a standard on the mainland. There isn't one in Hong Kong. I've told you many times, I take medicines for testing as well. Why is it the state sets some highest limit, but we don't set one? As for the CHM standards, the testing is about the CHMs themselves, but then instead you have stage 1 and stage 2. Stage 1, you take the CHMs. If there's an accident, then you will then do a concoction of the CHMs, and then you test whether there's accidents. It's only in the stage 2 testing you will confirm whether medicine is fine or not, but the mainland doesn't do the same. You take the mainland standards as your stage 2 testing on a concoction of the medicine, so you are not adopting the standards properly. I don't know why you come up with this Hong Kong practice. Is it a form of cheating? Well, I'm asking all these questions because we can't just adopt whatever we like from mainland, but on the mainland they don't do it this way, but you distort practice. Why do we have to have first and second stage of testing? I have to ask experts what is the significance of doing that. But anyway, thank you, Madam Chair, for giving me the opportunity to ask these questions. Can we get some answers, please? Dr. Choi. Now, when the Department of Health enforces the law, there are already clear guidelines and industry standards. So the Department of Health can ensure that Chinese medicine products on the market are in compliance with these standards. So we already take out such enforcement action now. And the purpose of this bill is to give the statutory powers to the Director of Health to issue Chinese medicine safety order for the recalling of problematic products as necessary. So this amendment does not change in any way the existing codes and standards. Now, Dr. Helena WONG asked whether there's room for improvement for such codes and standards. Yes, we will need to review that. And we are happy to take this up with Dr. Wong on another occasion. But for the purpose of this bill, we're talking about a well-established recall system. We're just trying to codify it, and so there is a legal basis. And then in the amendment bill, we state clearly that if anyone is affected and feels aggrieved by the Chinese medicine safety order, there is an appeal mechanism. In fact, the Director of Health wouldn't just casually issue a safety order. Only when we encounter problematic products, then the director will first have discussion with the proprietors. If they voluntarily recall the products, then there's no need to issue the order. The order is only issued because the business refuses to recall the product. On tracing the source of medicines. Now, for all medicine, there must be a batch number. So if there is a problem, then it's easy for us to trace the products. And in our day-to-day surveillance, we can see that in the packaging of Chinese medicine, there is a batch number, so it's possible to trace the source. As for heavy metal and pesticide residues, I fully appreciate the members' concern. Let me explain this briefly. Well, in fact, internationally, there is not a consensus on pesticide residue limits on the mainland. There are standards for just 4 types of Chinese medicines for pesticide residue. In Taiwan, there are 16 such medicines with pesticide residue limits. And so, as we legislated for the regulation of sales of medicines, we refer to the WHO's standards. For 605 medicines, there are now pesticide residue limits under the WHO framework. Because there is not a set of international standards, so for this 605 medicines, we are talking about safety assessment. By that we mean when the medicine is taken, then what is the level? So that's the standard for consideration. Of course, if there are other practices we could make reference to elsewhere, we could see how we could amend our regulation standards. In some countries like the UK and the European Union, they have pesticide residue limits for herbal plants, but usually these are Western herbs, not the decoction pieces or raw herbs we're talking about. For decoction pieces, they've been treated in some way. So are we going to apply directly the overseas standards here? Then we have to see whether the nature of the medicine is the same and so on. So for the pesticide residue limits now, it covers the 605 medicines in Schedule 2, and there are also 37 pesticides covered. Thank you. Mr. Xiu Kao-fai. Thank you, Madam Chair. For 7+1, the department did not give any response. You said you would just consider it. Fine. I already made my point that in the market there is a large number of such products you don't regulate is not desirable. And you first enacted this law, you said the law would cover 80%, and so you thought it was fine. But, businessmen are so smart. If you leave any gray area, they will exploit the gray area. Now things have gone beyond control. So I think it's time for you to consider seriously whether you should tackle this. Second point, Dr. Helena Wong asked about the pesticide residue standards. Now, the department said that you will look at the medicine that's cooked or concocted. Let's say the medicine is cooked, and then you will test the medicine ready to drink and see if there's accidents. Is that what you do? Is that what you mean?
The bill, we have to give the director the power to issue the CMSO, but in the definition of the propriety medicine, we have promised to do that as soon as possible. And Dr. Choi can respond to the second question. The pesticide residue is for consumption and the Chinese materia medica. If they require it to be a decoction, then we will take samples from the decoction and check for the pesticide residue. Allow me to supplement on the sulfur dioxide. We understand members' concern. We are working on sulfur dioxide inspection for Hong Kong standards, and we hope we can conclude that, how to conduct laboratory samples, and we will issue the guidelines for detecting sulfur dioxide and standards. So that is part of our work ambit. So in the next step, we will set standards for sulfur dioxide when the Hong Kong standards are concluded. Why did I want to ask the question? Ms. Helena Wong said that in the mainland, they do conduct analysis for the active pharmaceutical ingredients, and in Hong Kong we only examine the decoction. And I have asked the industry, and they say that Chinese medicine, these are herbs and hard material. So after you cook it, you're only going to drink the soup. You're not going to eat the raw material. So the consumed item is actually the fluids, the decoction. So whether it's we want to know whether the decoction is harmful. They don't eat the herbs. So in the food health department, that's why they use that wording. They did not check for whether it exceeded safety standards in the active pharmaceutical ingredients. Even for the general public, they only worried what is consumed. They will throw away all the other materials. They only consume the fluids. Let's say if the cooking utensil was contaminated, but they don't eat the container. They only consume the fluids. I would like to follow up on the supply chain. If the wholesaler sells to the retailer, retail sells to the consumer. But let's say one of the in the chain we have a shell company. So the shell company has absconded, and the front line. How do you follow up the retailers because they will be selling the product the next day? So who is liable? Dr. Choi? Well, the background currently, if we issue a safety order and if they refuse to comply with the safety order, or if nobody has undertaken the task of complying with the safety order, that it's a health concern. So the government, first of all, will issue a press release, will notify the public that the product has run into problems. Second, we might have to go to all the retail outlets and stop the sale of that product. So if we come into that scenario, we do have a mechanism, even though it does use a lot of resources, but we will make sure that the item is not supplied to the public. In other words, if part of the supply chain has absconded, the supplier has tried to trace them, but they've absconded, and there's a break in the chain, we don't know where it's being sold. The distributor sells to the retailer, they don't know where it is ultimately, so the responsibility isn't with the supplier. Can I put it that way, Dr. Choi? Well, we'll have to look at it case by case. How much evidence we have to indicate that there's a break in the supply chain, they cannot find the supplier. So I cannot answer the legal question about where the liability lies. Well, the whole safety principle is to stop the supply of the faulty product. And we do have a product recall system. Well, the CMSO, it deals with a recipient of the CMSO. There is a designated person who receives the CMSO, and if they don't comply, then they breach the law. So if they don't, people who don't receive the CMSO are not affected. So as Dr. Choi said, the Department of Health will will investigate who will be the recipient of CMSO, the Chinese Medicine Safety Order. Well, I just want to highlight a possible scenario. If you issue a letter to the frontline retailers, and if you issue a letter to the supplier says they have tried to locate the person in the middle, but they've absconded and we don't know. Let's say you sold 100,000 and we can recall 50,000 of them, but we don't know where the other products went. Because that party has absconded. So I just want you to pay attention that we don't want the complying parties to be burdened. I would like to come back to the question: Chinese medicine ordinance in Hong Kong. It's quite complex. I represent the industry, and they are very worried. They are afraid they are breaching faulty sales for let's say in massage providers. So when they use the phrases that improve blood circulation and so on, they are afraid that they are breaking the law. So a lot of frontline staff don't know whether they are breaking the law. I talked about the Employee Retraining Bureau, the Employee Retraining Board. They have these courses, and they have been teaching people for years how to do massage. So these people are worried because of Cap 549. And when I had a meeting yesterday, they said that this wasn't devised recently. The ordinance was commenced in 1999, but nobody arrested massage providers, and the arrests only happened recently. They are only the law enforcement agencies are just complying with the law. If somebody calls the police will go investigate, and they are talking about Chinese massage, and when they use the terms of the phrase "improve blood circulation," then they might have breached the law. So how can people do business? That's what people are afraid of now. So, Chairman, we feel that we need to deal with it comprehensively. Thank you, Chairman. Simple response, Mr. Chen. Regarding other parts of law enforcement of the Chinese medicine ordinance, we are willing to discuss with the industry. Any other questions, Ms. Helena Wong? Well, I think the government and Mr. Xiu have not read my paper. On the last occasion, I had another food safety meeting on 27th of September. I spent a lot of effort on talking about Chinese medicine standards. But when you conduct when you do take the sample, you take samples from the decoction in the second stage. So you have confused the application of the standard. So we understand the concoction, the fluids, the concoction fluids, whether it's harmful to the public. I agree that is good to know, but if that is your approach, then shouldn't you set standards for decoctions? No, you're not doing that. You are taking the Chinese materia medica standards and applying it to the decoction, the cooked material. So there's a problem. And on the 27th of September paper, I mentioned in the third point, in your response to paragraph 14, you say that according to the materia medica standards, in the heavy metal and residual pesticide chapter, in the sample preparation, you just talk about converting the herbs into powder, disintegrating the herb. You are not talking about the cooked material. So even in your own documents, when you talk about the sample, you don't talk about the decoction, the residue in the decoction. So that is a problem. Will there be disputes? If you recall this product, if you go to the pharmacies, they have the uncooked material. They also have the decoction cooked, and you are now taking samples from the raw materials or the decoction itself, and you decide whether you want to recall the product, or do you take samples from both? Do you want to take samples from the phase 1 and phase 2? If they don't exceed, then you won't issue a product recall. Or is it only in stage 2 when it's cooked into a decoction and it exceeds the standard that you will issue a product recall? Well, this is related. I'm not conceiving it out of the blue, because in the future, the consumers and the pharmacies, they would want to know if it's not cooked. If it doesn't exceed the standard, you won't take it off the shelves. They are not breach law. But that's not what it says in the law, in the ordinance. There are batch lots that you need to import from a reputable supplier. It cannot be harmful for human consumption. So when you add that all together, it's not clear. It's ambiguous. The law cannot be ambiguous if the batch lot is not clear. If there are sufficient reasons for taking it off the shelf, or do you have to wait till the decoction is cooked, that the fluids exceed the standards, and then you require a product recall? Do you require everything to be made into a decoction? Because the ordinance doesn't include guidelines, even though you say there are guidelines. Well, first of all, I think we need to take a look at the guidelines. Otherwise, I don't know how you're going to enforce the law. Because the devil is in the details. That's where the disputes will occur. So we need a document from the government. We need to take a look at the guidelines. So could you deal with the queries that I have posed? The guidelines, do we need an amendment? So I'd like the government to answer these few questions first. Dr. Choi, under what circumstances do you determine that the TCM needs to be recalled? Does it have to be cooked into a decoction in phase 2? And the second question is about the guidelines. Chairman.
Madam Chair, the member asked about incorporating certain standards. I think she's referring to the Chinese material medical standards. That's one. And another is regulatory standards. So there are two sets of standards at the moment for the regulatory standards. And in other words, we are checking for 37 pesticide residues and 4 heavy metals. And then there's the standards that apply to consumption of the medicine. It's not the same as the Hong Kong Chinese medical material standard. That's about quality. But Hong Kong CMMS is currently not a mandatory standard. It's a reference standard. So the two sets of standards are different. Members refer to the HKCMMS standards. Let's say when raw medicines are made into powder form, and then that's a testing, then that testing standard applies to the medicine in a powder form. But when we talk about recall, we're talking about regulatory standards for products that need to be recalled. That means they exceed the standards for the 37 pesticide residues or the 4 heavy metals. And if at stage 1 of the test there's accidents, then of course we must go on to stage 2 to see that at the point of consumption, whether there's accidents. Only then would we order recall. Now, of course, if we could see more references from other places in the future, then we can see what we can do in terms of quality standards. That means we want to raise the standards of medicines, or if medicines don't meet the quality standards, they should still be recalled. Yes, we can consider in future if that's the we can get more references from other places. But right now we're talking about safety standards, not quality standards. For the 4 codes, we can provide to members after the meeting. In fact, it's on our website, the codes for the 4 types of licenses. So there are 2 sets of standards now, I find. One set is the Hong Kong CMMS 605 medicines, right? Hong Kong CMMS has now worked on 270 medicines on standard quality standards. For the Hong Kong Chinese Medicine Council, there are 605 medicines under Schedule 2. What do you mean? That's the Hong Kong Chinese Medicine Council. It regulates the safety of medicines sold in the market. It's in the schedule. Schedule 2, there are 37 pesticide residues and 4 heavy metals. We have regulatory standards at the point of consumption. For the 270 medicines or the 605 medicines and the standards, is the case that there are no standards for pesticide residues or the 4 heavy metals. For HKCMMS, that is the Hong Kong Chinese Medical Materia standards, they have standards for pesticide residues and heavy metals. And is that the standards followed by Hong Kong? For the HKCMMS standards, that's a reference standard. It's currently not a mandatory standard. In terms of regulation, I mentioned the 37 pesticide residues and 4 heavy metals. There are standards under the Chinese Medicine Council of Hong Kong. Now for the HKCMMS, it's something good because the government has spent a lot of resources with the help of experts to come up with these standards. And there are 270 medicines covered. The pesticide residue and the heavy metal standards have been set for these medicines. How come? Can you explain? In terms of regulation, you only includes 37 pesticide residues and 4 heavy metals in setting standards. For the 275 medicines, is it the case that usually the for pesticide residues there are only standards for 37 of them, and for heavy metals only 4 have standards? Is that what you mean? Sorry, can the member repeat her question? I don't quite follow about the 270 medicines. Well, I'm not a Chinese medicine expert. I'm just a legislator. I'm just using common sense in asking this question. You're talking about standards. And you're talking about regulatory standards and which cover 37 pesticide residues. In other words, the highest permitted limit. And then for 4 heavy metals, you have 4 standards. You have set standards. So for any medicines, they cannot be more than the standards for heavy metals. But then under HKCMMS, you say there are 275 medicines, right? So for these 275 medicines, and at the same time you're regulating 37 pesticide residues and 4 heavy metals. Is it the case that even for the 275 medicines, it's the same standard for the 37 pesticide residues and 4 heavy metals? Because you say for the 605 medicines, does each have a pesticide residue or heavy metal standard? And you say yes. So now I'm asking you for the 275 medicines under HKCMMS. Is it the case that they also cover the 37 pesticide residues and the 4 heavy metals? Under your current surveillance standards, have you left out anything? In the schedule 1, of there is an appendix 1 to our response. Which paper? On the 12th of October, we submitted paper. Paper number 16. There are 35 paragraphs. Is it CB bracket 2, 16 stroke 17 to 18 bracket 02? I don't have the paper number. Cover letter dated 12th of October. So the paper number is CB bracket 2, 16 stroke 17 to 18 bracket 02. Appendix 1 to that paper, right? Yes, in Appendix 1, it already lists out that in our regular surveillance and regulation, we lay down the highest permitted residue level. Now, there are two types of organochloro pesticide. Please wait. Dr. Wong hasn't found the paper. Oh, yes. Thank you. Are you fine? Yes. Dr. Shui, please continue. Yes, in Appendix 1 there are two tables there. The first one is for organochlorine pesticide residues. There are 20 items under regulation, and there are 9 groups in total. For each group, altogether there are 20 items for testing, and the highest permitted limit is set out there. And the next table is on organophosphate pesticide residues. There are 17 items. So these are the regulatory standards for the 37 pesticide residues at the point of consumption. As for the HKCMMS, the standards are for quality control. If you want me to compare HKCMMS and our regulatory standards, for HKCMMS they cover organochlorine but not organophosphate pesticide residues. And for heavy metals, the HKCMMS covers the same for heavy metals as for our regulatory standards. Now, see, in the other paper 2106/16 to 17 bracket 03, Appendix 3, there's a table on heavy metal. There's one dated the 22nd of September. CB bracket 22104/16 to 17 bracket 03, Annex 3, page 2. Or Appendix 3, page 2. Yes, perhaps I'll wait for the member to find it. Yes, thank you for telling me about these 37 items, but you have not answered my question. You didn't get my question? Your question was for HKCMMS, the pesticide residues, are the standards the same as for our regulatory standards? Have we taken them out? Yes, you have 275 medicines, right, under HKCMMS. Are there any pesticide residues not in the 37? Let me explain that again. For HKCMMS, for pesticide residue items, there are 20 items, 20 organochloro. But for HKCMMS, there are no organophosphate. In other words, our regulatory standards cover more pesticide residues than the HKCMMS. Why is there this difference? After you ask this question, Mr. Xu would also like to ask questions, right? Why is there this difference? Well, I think it's a matter of safety consideration for organophosphate phosphate pesticide residue, the half-life is short. So after cooking, if it's still there and if it exceeds the limit, of course, there will be safety risk. Now, over a decade ago, when you consider safety risk, we included both organochloro and organophosphate pesticide residues. But in the Chinese pharmacopedia, there is actually no surveillance on organophosphate pesticide residue. So over a decade ago, when we decided the standard, we considered the practices of many countries before we included them. What about heavy metal? Are there just 4? Well, for the HKCMMS and our regulatory standards, is the same for heavy metals. Thank you. Mr. Shiu Ka-fai, if I could pick up on what Dr. Helena Wong said. Yeah, I know Dr. Helena Wong is very much concerned about food safety. I respect that. But let's go back to the example quoted earlier. There are so many types of Chinese medicines, thousands of them. And we don't know how many thousands of Chinese medicines have so many different thousands of substances not good. So if I'm not an expert, I can't debate with you what's good and what's not. But put simply, Chinese medicine is something we consume orally. So we have to make sure what we consume orally is safe. That's really our concern as to how the Chinese medicines are produced, or how complicated process is. Really, for myself or any general member of the public, we cannot really understand all that. I think the principle is that whatever we take in orally, you have to test it to see, make sure it doesn't cause harm to our body. Now, of course, if the government have unlimited resources, you can ask someone to test all medicines all around the world. But if there are limited resources, then we need to strike a balance. I can give you another example. I mean, construction. It's like building materials, concrete. We need to do stress tests. Why do we need to do stress tests for concrete? Because if concrete is not hard enough, then the building could collapse. So this is very important in terms of safety for the public. That's why the concrete must be hard enough. But how do we produce concrete? There could be different ingredients. There may be sand, there may be rubbles, or even foam. And then we have to test each material and see if it's hard enough. But when each material is hard enough, doesn't mean the final product is hard enough. So there's two separate matters. But the foam, of course, may not be hard, but if it's in concrete, in a finished product, maybe it's hard enough, so it's safe. So if I just focus on whether the foam is hard enough or the sand is hard enough, but it may not be the same thing when I'm talking about the finished product, the concrete, that is whether the concrete itself is hard enough. It's the same with this bill. I just want to make sure that the medicine we cook is safe to consume. There could be thousands of materials or substances in there, but I really can't figure that out. Thank you.
I understand Ms. Wong's concern. Of course, we want what we consume to be safe, and we would like a strict testing standard to ensure that the decoction is safe. If we have a stringent testing procedure, and we also have proprietary medicines that can be cooked by water, and if we have residual pesticide, it would be detrimental to health. That's why we want stringent testing standards. I understand that. But I feel the government should have a lengthy discussion with Ms. Wong. As I said, we'd like a written explanation, because the discussion gave rise to 200 items, 600 standards, Hong Kong standards, safety standards. So we would like a written explanation, because I need to be fair to other legislators who weren't in attendance. So you need to give us a written response, and could you also make reference to Ms. Helena Wong's question? Because it might not be fair to you now to ask you to explain the whole testing procedure. We can only allot 10 minutes question time per legislator, and that is not sufficient. So you need to meet with Ms. Helena Wong and talk in greater detail. You need to alleviate her fears and concerns. You also need to explain how to make your testing more stringent. We talked about the sulfur dioxide, and we need to have a better understanding because the current time constraint doesn't allow for a full explanation. If you could give a detailed response, it would be better for your case. So could you also provide a written response on your laboratory testing? Ms. Helena Wong? The government pledged that they haven't responded regarding the heavy metals. I asked for phase 1 testing, phase 2 testing. They said it's in a different document. They only dealt with a pesticide residual. They didn't deal with the heavy metals. So there is an earlier document, 22nd of September. On my 27th of September question, there was a response. There's Annex 1 and 2, but that is just about pesticide residue. They have not answered regarding heavy metals. So could they provide a document in phase 1 testing, phase 2 testing, and your standards? So I'd like to ask, in heavy metals, we only regulate 4, cadmium, arsenic, cadmium, lead, and mercury. So in the 2015 Chinese Materia Medica, the version, they have 5 heavy metals. There's copper, arsenic, cadmium, lead, and mercury. They also describe the testing process. So I'd like to ask, why do we only regulate 4 heavy metals only? You remember that with the excess lead in PRH, we had to include copper as well. And I'd like to ask, in Chinese medicine, why do we only test for these 4 heavy metals? I understand it's more toxic if there's arsenic, cadmium, lead, mercury. It's carcinogenic and it's toxic. I don't disagree with that, but I just want to ask, have you omitted anything? Well, allow me to have a meeting, fix a meeting date with Ms. Helena Wong later. I'll give you a short description. In the Chinese Medica Materia, they have listed the heavy metals. There are not a lot of heavy metals. If you want to sample the Chinese medicine, in Hong Kong we have 605 elements and 4 heavy metals. It's more than the Materia Medica. But why is copper not included? The decision was based on the reference material. So what reference material did you use? We do have to deal with a lot of background information and considerations and comparisons. Different literature make different. You don't have this information on hand, right? I don't have the detailed information, but I suggest I can have a separate meeting with Ms. Helena Wong. We also need more colleagues in attendance because different countries, as I said initially, there isn't any consensus internationally regarding heavy metal and pesticide residue in Chinese medicine. So in our response, legislators like to know pesticide residue in stage 1. So even though we don't look at the results of stage 1, we look at this consumption stage. So I understand legislators are concerned about stage 1, so that's why in our 12th of October Annex 2, in the past we have 53 samples. In stage 1 we have some pesticide residue, but after second stage it complies with our requirements. So regarding all stage 1 raw data, that is very hard because it involves a lot of resources, a lot of workflow steps to collect that data. So I hope you can understand. Stage 1 is an intermediate step. We have provided data for 53 samples. Regarding heavy metals, you did not ask for stage 1 data. I'll have to refer back to your letter. I'll do my best. Well, if it facilitates our understanding, Annex 2, it deals with stage 1, but they don't have stage 2 side by side. But the data is not there. We cannot comprehend this data. We cannot make a comparison. So if you could include stage 1, stage 2, it might make our comprehension, it might facilitate our comprehension. Well, all stage 2 complies with our requirements, and even if you look at our standards, it's below our it's below our standards, and we have to refer back to our raw data. We have to see, we have to look at the raw data that did not exceed our standards. So we have to look at all the data starting from the monitoring of the situation. We're not, I'm just asking for the recent figures from the recent year, not from the past decade. I just want to see whether it's reasonable. You use stage 2, you said it did not exceed the standard. It was the same with the excessive lead in PRH. The government said there was no problem, it didn't exceed WHO standards. I'm asking you how much. If we accepted that response, we wouldn't have detected excessive lead in PRH water supply. Why are we so worried? If we could, if we didn't have worries, we could have a smooth development of TCM in Hong Kong. We could do better than mainland if we have clear standards. The mainland could make reference to us if we have very clear standards. That's my expectations of the government. I hope. I don't want you to perceive me as an obstacle to development. I do communicate with the TCM industry. I want this to proceed, and I want it to develop and flourish. We need to be responsible. We don't know when the ordinance can be reviewed. That's why we ask for questions. We ask for documents, and we ask questions. We're monitoring the government, and we're living up to the public's expectations. Of course, if we don't have sufficient time to deal with all problems, I don't mind having another meeting where we can meet with the Department of Health. I won't rule that out. But I hope that if you can provide a side-by-side comparison in phase 1, phase 2 testing, perhaps we can identify the issues. But we need the data, Mr. Chan. The government would welcome legislators' views and opinions and on how to do a better job. But the questions involved today are quite complex. So let's fix an appointment day and give a more detailed explanation, such that members can have a better grasp of the situation. If it's complex, could we allow Mr. Junius Ho to ask a question first? Chairman, I'm not familiar with this topic, and I'm here to learn, especially regarding DDT and so on. I don't know what that is, but I know that we are dealing with organochlorine and organophosphates. The Hong Kong standards, they weren't worried about organophosphor because the half-life is very short. We're just now expanding the scope a little wider and enhancing food safety. I totally accept that. I don't know the technical side of it. The only question, well, basically I support the ordinance. The only question I have is regarding the intermediate product. How do we test that? Because I see in 138A how they describe the process. Does that cover the decoction? If there's a Chinese pharmacy where they get a diagnosis and they are prescribed a formula, but some TCMs, when they're cooked together, then you might then heavy metals or residual pesticides would occur. So I would like to ask, does that include the decoction? Dr. Choi? In our amendment bill regarding intermediate product, we're not talking about the decoction, the soup. In the production of medicine, let's say from the raw material, they want to create a capsule, so they might have to you have to powder the herb, and let's say we're talking about powder, and that proprietary Chinese medicine manufacturer, it's not a capsule, it's a powdered herb, and they supply it to other manufacturers, and if we detect safety issues or quality issues, we can issue a product recall. I understand, Chairman. Then I have no questions. I have to rely on you on the technical side, and I hope that we can enter the clause-by-clause scrutiny. I already have faith in the government. They have the best of intentions. They can deal with the risks, and we don't need to spend time on the technical side. I have faith in the government. I would like to see the ordinance enter clause-by-clause scrutiny as soon as possible, because it was tabled at the beginning of the year, and we need to see a timely conclusion. I have a question about timetable. When will we enter clause-by-clause scrutiny? Well, I was hoping to achieve clause-by-clause today, so I'm now considering. Ms. Helena Wong had some questions that requires a subsequent submitting of documents. Well, if other colleagues don't have questions, we'll allow Ms. Helena Wong to action, and we'll start with the clause-by-clause scrutiny, and on the next meeting, if we have further documents to be supplemented by the government, then we can have a discussion. And in the meantime, the government officials could explain to Ms. Wong the testing methodologies, the standards, and the background. So, Ms. Wong, you can ask this round of questions. If we don't have questions from other members, we can start the clause by clause.
Madam Chair, I've submitted all my papers. Of course, we must go through all my documents before we can go to clause by clause scrutiny. On heavy metal standards, I hope the administration will give us a response later. Because with food, the government is now doing consultation, as I mentioned last time. So you want to review the standards for heavy metal in food, seafood, fish, oysters, vegetables, rice, because the standards were set too long ago. Now, for the 4 heavy metal standards in Chinese medicines and the proposed revision of the heavy metal standards in food now being consulted, I've done some comparison, and I said in my paper, for heavy metal control in food is a lot more stringent than that for Chinese medicines. In the government's consultation document, say food, mineral water, cadmium, (0.05 to 2 micrograms per liter). And for arsenic and cadmium standards in Chinese medicines, the permitted limits are higher than that for food. I mentioned this when we talked about the consultation, and they said this has nothing to do with the Food and Health Food and Health Bureau, but it's to do with the Health Services Panel. Or no, it's not to do with the Food and Health Bureau, but rather it's better to be dealt with by the Health Services Panel. Because I was going to ask why there were 2 sets of standards. In paragraph 18 of the administration's response, you say for Chinese medicines and food, they are different. And we don't eat every day. But then some in the community have expressed concern to me. Some are chronic patients, some are cancer patients. They take Chinese medicines on a long-term basis. But you set the standards assuming that people only take Chinese medicines occasionally, but that may not be true. So is there any room or need to amend the standards? That's the first question. Maybe you can answer me first. Dr. Choi? Now, we mentioned in the document for Chinese medicines and food, they are 2 separate items. And we mentioned that in early meetings. For foods, there could be alternatives, but for Chinese medicines, now when a Chinese doctor sees a patient, he prescribes a particular medicine. So it's treatment needs. And of course, we have to look at the efficacy of the medicines, how that it may benefit patients. At the same time, the bad side effects, we have to look at that, such as the pesticide residue or heavy metals. For Chinese medicine, most have to be cooked before they are taken. So it's not the same as food. You may just consume it directly. So that's different too. If we apply the standards for food to medicines, then we have to consider where foods and medicines are similar and where they're dissimilar before we could then apply directly the standards for food to medicines. After Dr. Wong is Mr. Ben Chen. Are you timing me? Have I finished? No. That's why I say after you ask your questions. Next is Mr. Chen. So the administration is saying you are not going to review the standards, correct? Right? For heavy metals, for Chinese medicines. We are constantly reviewing the standards because we see exactly there is not an international standard, so we are always looking out for new standards. What about the mainland? Now, in the PRC's pharmacopedia, there are only 4 pesticide residue standards for Chinese medicines. What about heavy metals? They have several heavy metals, but I don't have the information at hand. they do have heavy metal standards for Chinese medicines. So it's not a case that there are no standards, right? Perhaps I could ask my colleague to check for me and I can answer later. From my recollection, for heavy metal, there are under 10 where there are standards for Chinese medicines, but I have to check the exact number. My colleagues are doing that. Now, in Hong Kong, we regulate 605 medicines. Well, they don't have enough information today. I want the information afterwards. Now, for Chinese medicine, you're only regulating 4 heavy metals. So I want justification as to why there are just 4 heavy metals, but maybe you say on the mainland there are some 10 heavy metals being regulated. So can you list out the standards for the 4 in Hong Kong? And then for mainland, how many heavy metals are regulated and what the standards are? And also for other places, what standards they have and what they are. Only then can we see whether for the 4 heavy metal standards you've got now, if they're reasonable. Now, I question whether we should compare standards for food and Chinese medicine. You say you can't, but then to the public, they don't care. It's something they consume orally. So it affects their health, whether it's medicine or food. But you want to evade that question, I will still pursue it. I will ask you when you're going to do the review. And when you do the review, well, you make reference to other places. Mainland, Taiwan, EU, North America. Do they have heavy metal standards, and which heavy metals do they regulate, and so on? We need to have such information, because now we are giving them powers to regulate the 37 pesticide residues and the 4 heavy metals. And we have to ask, of course, why there are just 4 heavy metals and why the standards are set as such. So we need to be clear about that. Dr. Choi, please clarify. I mentioned the PLC pharmacopedia and the number of medicines in that. So for Chinese pharmacopedia, for medicines where there's some heavy metal control, I vaguely remember it's under 10, but of course I don't have the information at hand, so we have to check the exact number. So we're talking about the number of medicines regulated. There are 605 in Hong Kong, in the Chinese pharmacopedia is under 10. But I said from the outset, for different places, there are different numbers of items for the control of heavy metal or pesticide residues, and there is no international consensus. It's because Chinese medicines are treated differently in different places. Or maybe Chinese medicines are used differently in different places. That's why so far there is no consistency. And since there is no uniform standards, so we have to we make references to what in other places. And now for the standards we have now, they were set over 10 years ago, having referenced other practices. But as I said, we keep reviewing the standards. We would just apply standards from other places directly to Hong Kong. Would that be appropriate? And apart from applying the standards, we have to consider the risks. Now, if we require medicines to meet certain standards, and if the limits are exceeded, what does that mean? A quality problem or a safety problem? So we need to do safety analysis. And to do safety analysis, we have to look exactly how the medicine is taken, how often it's taken in a year, under what circumstances the medicine is taken, or whether it's in powder form or whatever. So we need to find out exactly for each item. That's why when we set standards, we have to be very prudent. We need to make reference to the practices in other places, and we have to find out how medicines are used, how they are cooked, or the condition, the form in which it's taken. And if there is exceedance of the limit, does it really pose a safety risk? And so these are all factors we have to consider very carefully. But I must say that all along the government has been actively reviewing the different elements with public concern, such as heavy metals and so on. Thank you. I'll wait in turn again. Mr. Chen. Thank you, Madam Chair. Of course, we're concerned about heavy metals and pesticide residues. But for any standards, we can't just pluck them out of thin air, especially when it comes to Chinese medicines. And we can't compare the standards of food and of medicines. As the Bureau pointed out, we don't take medicine every day. Of course, there are people who take medicine on a long-term basis, and maybe that's something we need to pay attention to. But other than that, we can't just directly compare with the standards of food, because you can increase the standards to that for food, but would you find supply in the market? And then we shouldn't just look at the standards overseas. Maybe you have to look at the PRC pharmacopedia, because China is the country that uses the most Chinese medicine. You can't just refer to the standards of the EU or North America. So we need to look at the whole picture. And Dr. Choi made a good point. We have to look at how medicine is taken. It doesn't mean if there is a problem with the standard, then there's definitely a problem. We have to look at the whole work. So, of course, if there's a chance to review the standards, I welcome that. But we can't just always raise it to the maximum standard. That's not helping things. While we want to protect public health, we have to pay attention to the reality. And I fully agree with Dr. Choi. Anything else? I don't have a question, really. I wonder if the administration has anything to say in response. Well, my colleagues have found the information for me. Let me go back to the Chinese pharmacopedia. It's not under 10. There are 27. In the PRC Pharmacopedia 2015 edition, there are 27 medicines for which there are heavy metal standards. I can give you examples. Hawthorne, lead, cadmium, mercury, copper. For another one, Sai Hongfa, just one heavy metal, not for copper, mercury or cadmium. So if you look at the 27 medicines in the PRC Pharmacopedia, then for the different medicines there are different standards for the different heavy metals. But then for us in Hong Kong, there are 605 medicines, and we apply the same heavy metal standards for the 4 heavy metals. You mean 605 medicines and 4 heavy metal standards? Yes. Dr. Wong? Then Dr. Choi has explained why copper is not one of the heavy metals controlled. I don't have the information at hand. Perhaps after words, when I meet with Dr. Wong, I can explain. Why is copper not regulated?
Why are you only regulating 4 heavy metals? But the Chinese pharmacopoeia will also test for copper. I don't. It's not the data. I'm just asking why you are regulating 4 heavy metals and you are omitting the Chinese pharmacopoeia standard on copper. Our standard was set more than 10 years ago. That's the problem. It's a 10-plus-year-old standard. You need to move with the times. You need to rationalize the standard. You need to safeguard public health. I'm working very hard with the food standards. The health department is just sitting on its hands. You're saying that this is the mainland PRC 2015 standard. I'm asking, why isn't copper here? I'm not asking for the copper data. I'm asking why you don't include copper. I don't have the information on hand. That's why we have to ask so many questions. Because the Department of Health won't budge. I have to spend a lot of effort on the food standards. You have not changed the standards in 10 plus years, whereas the food standards have been in place for 20 plus years. So the PRC, even though a lot of people don't like it, but but they have taken steps in 2015. They're taken steps in the right direction. You need to learn from them. So even if you don't deal with all the problems in this amendment bill, I would like the Department of Health to review the 37 pesticides and 4 heavy metals. Are there any omissions? And second, have they moved with the times and updated the standards? That is what I'm trying to drive at. If you say, after dealing with this bill, we will review this 10+ year standard, whether there's room for improvement, we'll conduct consultation, you can consult the industry, the academia, and the public, I'll shut up. But if you say that's all we have, 37 plus 4, I won't accept that. As I stated in the beginning of the meeting, I told the government the bill committee has highlighted the problems. Different stakeholders have different levels of dissatisfaction. Manufacturers have dissatisfaction, retailers have dissatisfaction, users are unhappy. So the government needs to address this dissatisfaction. And after so many meetings, there is one message. The government, in reviewing, amending, and encouraging the industry development, is moving at a snail's pace. Some think your review is not proceeding, your regulatory regime is not progressing. So we have a blue bill in front of us and an opportunity to nudge the government. As Mr. Siogafai said, we'll have to wait years before we have another opportunity to nudge you in the right direction. So the government needs to pledge that they will address the different stakeholders' concerns. You need to do the review and consult stakeholders. At the beginning of the meeting, and even in the last deputation meeting, I asked the government to meet with the industry regarding the development of Chinese medicine, and the testing, monitoring. We need a better system, and you need to sit down with Ms. Helena Wong and other concerned legislators. You need to engage with them and review the ordinance. So, Mr. Chan, can you pledge that after the amendment we can deal with the deputation's concerns, the monitoring, the testing, review? I think if you can pledge that, our colleagues would be a bit more satisfied, and on the next occasion we can move into clause-by-clause scrutiny. Well, in the last deputation meeting, I pledged that I'm willing to talk with the stakeholders regarding policy development or policy amendment. We're willing to discuss. And we have 2 venues to discuss. We have the TCM Development Committee. We have the stakeholders from TCM. They will focus on the policy and development. And the second venue is the regulatory regime, including Chinese medicine standards, Chinese medicine product standards. So the Chinese Medicine Council has different subcommittees to deal with that. When you amend the standards, the industry needs to be able to comply for the exercise to be meaningful. So, regarding heavy metal and pesticide residue, Mr. Chan, please pause. You said that there were two committees following up, but as you conduct your work, how come the industry feels that the progress is slow and nothing is being done? You are relying on these two groups to amend the ordinance, to enhance standards. Is that sufficient? Is your engagement sufficient with the stakeholders? We're willing to have further discussion with the industry, and in the policy address we did outline our measures in TCM development. But regarding the standards amendment, there is regular industry participation. We're talking about heavy metal and pesticide residue. We are conducting work in this area. As Dr. Choi said, there isn't international consensus, and even the mainland pharmacopoeia is being updated, and the Chinese Medicine Board under the Chinese Medicine Council is continuing its work. We do have a response from legislators. Our scheduled end time is 12:45. If you just want to express your opinion, please do so. If you have questions, you might have to do it on the next meeting. Mr. Chen Hangban and Siu Gafai, I have two questions on food supplements. We have items sold as food in the market, but the manufacturer is a factory. So can factories produce or manufacture food? Could you check whether they can, when these drug manufacturers, can they manufacture food articles? You need to check the licensing, whether that is allowed. Now, you said that we don't have a team for development. We only have a regulatory team. So how many staff members do you have in the regulatory or the team? And I'd like to know, if time allows, when will we amend the principal legislation? If you can pledge a timetable, I'd be very happy. We can include HKS. You can see whether we can include that. Mr. Siu Gafai, I'd like to express some opinion. The Chinese medicine has thousands of years of history. We can only comment on this based on common sense, but the industry, whether they can comply, that is very important. It's pointless if they can't comply. So for industry participants, you need to consult them. You have to pay attention to their comments. If you ask me, I can only speak for myself. I don't know. If you're talking about toxicity and pesticide, I know it's not good. But if you're talking about thousands of years of history, I think you need to listen to the industry. The European standards won't understand TCM. Helena Wong, I just want a written response. Aside from the questions we asked, I had asked about Phase 2 testing methodologies and standards, whether the Chinese Medicine Board under the Chinese Medicine Council of Hong Kong, do they agree with that methodology? Do we have minutes of meeting? The government has not provided that. I asked about heavy metal regulation. Why? the daily limit, there's a daily intake limit for arsenic, but there's not that arrangement for cadmium. Some are on a dosage limit, some are on a daily limit. That is not standardized. So could the government explain that? And then we need the government to deal with sulfur dioxide. I'm happy to hear that Dr. Choi is working on that. You want to set the standard for sulfur dioxide. The standards are set. The 2015 Chinese pharmacopoeia has stated 150 parts per million. The testing methodologies, they would have that unless you want a new methodology. In fact, there are some Hong Kong labs testing for sulfur dioxide. So do you think testing for SO2 in food and medicine need different standards? That's why you haven't decided and include SO2 in the regulatory regime. And after this amendment, you won't be able to regulate SO2. Well, time's almost up. We will set aside another meeting date. I don't think this will it will be that soon. We need more time for preparation. The information you called for was quite substantial, and we hope the government can use this time to sort out their questions with the concerned legislator, and you need to explain in greater detail. And we hope that we can reconvene in next month. If things go smoothly, we can move into clause-by-clause scrutiny. So I'll give the government ample time for handling your documents. Thank you, everybody.